Part 2 of I Am a Doctor and I Gave a Talk on Critical Race Theory at Work, the origins of CRT. Let me go into screen sharing. Critical race theory, or CRT, had its most recent origins in American law schools in the 1970s after the civil rights movement made major gains. Harvard law professor Derek Bell is considered the grandfather of CRT. However, it was his protege, Kimberly Crenshaw, who first coined the term critical race theory in 1989. She wrote a paper called Mapping the Margins: Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. It was published in the Stanford Law Review in 1991 and propelled critical race theory into prominence in law schools and universities. Crenshaw is also the creator of the concept of intersectionality, which sets up identities along multiple axes of privilege and oppression. In Mapping the Margins, she wrote that she did this to create a political power block. Is that what we need in medicine? Other important figures of CRT include Richard Delgado, Jean Stefancic, Cheryl Harris, Charles Mill, Mari Matsuda, etc. Critical race theory is a direct ideological descendant of critical theory from the Frankfurt School, which was a German philosophical think tank. The critical theorists consist of neo-Marxists such as Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Antonio Gramsci, and Herbert Marcuse. In 1934, Herbert Marcuse immigrated to the United States and became very popular and influential. He became the PhD advisor of Angela Davis. She and other feminists, the Black feminists of the Combahee River Collective, strongly influenced Kimberly Crenshaw. So when people say that critical race theory is a Marxian theory, they are speaking literally, not metaphorically. They're not just noticing similarities, but are referring to the direct pedigree of ideological influence, including the use of symbols and gestures. When some other people deny that critical race theory is Marxist, they simply mean that it is not identical to classical Marxism, or as they call it, vulgar Marxism, which focuses on economic oppression rather than oppression based on identity. Like how teenagers rebel against their parents, later Marxians rebelled against some early Marxist ideas while keeping many others. Critical race theory is one of several next generation Marxian theories. The way I think about it is that all Marxian theories share the same hardware, the backbone idea that human beings are divided into groups of oppressor and oppressed people in a zero-sum conflict. You do not get to choose whether you are an oppressor or an oppressed person. Which group you fall into is based on power structures of society. Your individual beliefs, actions, and choices are irrelevant. Your group identity determines your character because of the way you are socialized by these power structures. This is a doctrine called structural determinism. Structural determinism. If you read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, you understand this. If you are perceived to be white, you have racial privilege, even if you don't identify as white. You are complicit in creating oppression, regardless of your personal beliefs, intentions, or actions. What differentiates all these different versions of Marxian theories is the specifics regarding who make up the oppressor and oppressed groups. Let's go back to China. There are many reasons the Cultural Revolution happened, but the ideological backbone that fueled the revolution was Marxism-Leninism, which became known as Maoism. In China's enactment of Maoism, the oppressor group consisted of landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, and right-wingers, the bourgeoisie. The oppressed group consisted of workers and poor peasants, the proletariat. The bourgeoisie and proletariat are locked in class conflict. Marxism is supposed to help people understand social power dynamics by giving them a special awareness called class consciousness, which helps them understand their oppression. Once the oppressed people properly understood their oppression by gaining class consciousness, they would rise up in a revolution, seize the means of production, and create a dictatorship of the proletariat, which controls wealth. Eventually, dictatorship of the proletariat would dissolve the state, and spontaneous communist utopia would take place and bring an end to history, where everyone participates in it. In that sense, classical Marxism can also be properly called critical class theory. It is a moral matrix in which one group of psychologically normal people can legitimize the scapegoating and persecution of people in another group by stereotyping them as oppressors. Critical race theory retains the hardware of oppressor-oppressed dynamics as outlined in Marxism. It replaces class with race. So there's my talk. Well, just kidding. There is more. Now, remember, I said that critical race theory is a mutated next generation Marxian theory. During the mutation process, CRT gained a powerful function by adopting tools from a French philosophy called postmodernism. Major postmodernists include figures like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, and Jean Baudrillard. Two major principles from postmodernism went on to strongly influence critical race theory. One, called the postmodern knowledge principle, says that objective knowledge or objective truth can never be obtained. Two, called the postmodern political principle, says that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies, which decide what can be known and how. In other words, what society considers to be knowledge is not really the truth, but merely an expression of power. There are also a couple of themes from postmodernism that informs critical race theory. For example, postmodernists believe that how we use language is very powerful and shapes social power dynamics. They call this types of language use discourses, and they believe that discourses literally create reality. This is how you get speech is violence. Also, postmodernists believe that there is no such thing as an individual or universal experience. There's no universal or individual human experience or identity. They believe that all human experiences are rooted in tribal group identities. Two people from two different identity groups cannot have a common identity or experience. So now we know that CRT is a product of American academia that had a strong German and French influence. What do critical race theorists believe? One definition of CRT is this: it is a worldview, an enclosed moral system, and a political movement predicated on the belief that the fundamental organization force of society is white supremacy. All social inequality is explained by white supremacy. In fact, the word racism is simply defined as the existence of any statistical differences between racial averages on important benchmarks, such as SAT scores, infant mortality, lifespan, or income, regardless of confounding factors or underlying causes. This is highlighted in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. In the CRT context, racism does not refer to the dictionary definition, which says that it is the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. Instead, the word racism refers to the sweeping structures of power in society that separate people into being either privileged or oppressed based on skin color. Critical race theorists also believe that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, normal science, the usual way society does business. This is a quote from the textbook, Critical Race Theory, and Introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk. It is a high school level textbook. It's not written for law schools. Critical race theorists believe that a revolution which disrupts and dismantles liberal society must happen before white supremacy can end. I should clarify that liberalism with a small l in this context refers to the political philosophy that revolves around liberty, right to private property, individuality, rationality, progress, the rule of law, and restrictions on the power of states and governments. Its opposite is totalitarianism. It is also very different from liberation, which is a Marxist concept that refers to ending oppression, sometimes oppression from reality. Many of today's conservatives, as well as liberals, both embrace this flavor of small l liberalism. Critical race theorists do not. Let me read you another quote from Delgado and Stefanczyk. The critical race theory CRT movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Let me read that again. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Neutral principles refer to not regarding race or any element of identity as a factor when it comes to the law. Now, do you have a sense regarding CRT's main objective? Revolution through identity politics. Let's talk more about white supremacy. White supremacy in the CRT context does not refer to Dylann Roof, KKK Nazis, and the Charlottesville Tiki Torch March. Those people are called white extremists in this paradigm. White supremacy refers to the mundane operations of everyday American life. To a layperson, white supremacy sounds horrible and conjures up the images of terrorists in white hoods carrying burning crosses. This term has a very negative emotional valence to it because of our truly very traumatic national history of grotesque racism in the past. That emotional valence is grafted onto this alternative definition of white supremacy specific to the context of CRT. This kind of linguistic sleight of hand is a theme throughout this belief system, a gift from postmodernism. Like white supremacy, most keywords in CRT have double meanings. We saw that earlier with the redefinition of the word racism. The emotional valence of the traditional definition of racism, which involves hating and mistreating people of color, is grafted onto a new definition referring to these invisible structures of society which render your intentions and attitudes irrelevant. A good way to think about all these linguistic manipulation is this. Critical race theorists share your vocabulary, but they use a different dictionary. So, main thesis of CRT, society is fundamentally marinated in white supremacy. According to Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, the question is not, did racism take place? Because presumably it has. But rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? She really is that cynical and wholly committed to this kind of confirmation bias. Her thesis is that white supremacy permeates society even without anyone intending it. She wrote, quote, "When you understand racism as a system of structured relations into which you are all socialized, you understand that intentions are irrelevant." What are some features of whiteness? First, the idea that people are individuals. The idea that you are you and not a representation, an archetype of your race is a white and privileged idea not available to people of color. Robin DiAngelo writes, the personal experience move, by which she means talking about one's personal experience if they're white. The personal experience move is tightly coupled with positioning oneself first and foremost as an individual. Positioning oneself as an individual is a classical signal of whiteness and works to decontextualize and depoliticize race. To Robin DiAngelo, depoliticizing race is bad. She insists in her popular book, White Fragility, that race must always be emphasized and regarded with profound political significance. She wrote, "This book is unapologetically rooted in identity politics. What this means is that you are not you. You are a representation of your race. If you disagree with that and insist that you are an individual with your own thoughts and actions, you are succumbing to white fragility." There is a very serious consequence to denying that people are individuals. If there are no individual identities and group tribal identity is the only thing that matters, then most of our conceptions regarding human rights are meaningless. Only privileges matter. Critical race theorists Delgado and Stefanczyk explain. Critical race theorists, are also highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. Rights are said to be alienating. They separate people from each other. Stay away, I got my rights, rather than encouraging them to form close, respectful communities. Let's now look at some other features of whiteness from the Smithsonian National Museum on African American History and Culture. Apparently, it includes things like objective, rational linear thinking, quantitative emphasis, following a schedule, nuclear families, and hard work. That's white supremacy. Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, also makes it clear that one cannot be an anti-racist without being anti-capitalist. He wrote, "To love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism." He often writes in that way. Owning private property is also a manifestation of white supremacy. Another tenet of critical race theory. Systemic racism is not only pervasive in scope, but also in time. It is a permanent feature of liberal societies. Surely in 2022, we're not as racist as we were in 1950 or 1865. Not so fast. Critical race theorists are very cynical about progress. They think racism just adapts and becomes better at hiding. Whereas slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, and redlining were egregiously racist. Currently, we live with a form of racism that is hard to see unless you're properly trained. Training in CRT gives you a special sense called color consciousness, which is the racial analog of class consciousness that we talked about before. With class consciousness, you understand your oppression in a capitalist society. What can you see with color consciousness? You see the racism in mundane everyday life that other people cannot see, and hear microaggressions that other people cannot hear. Derek Bell, the founding father of CRT, elaborates on this idea that racism is permanent. His writings were exceedingly cynical. He wrote, quote, "Progress in American race relations is largely a mirage, obscuring the fact that whites continue, consciously or unconsciously, to do all in their power to ensure their dominion and maintain their control. Black people will never gain full equality in this country. We must acknowledge it and move on to adopt policies based on what I call racial realism. This mindset or philosophy requires us to acknowledge the permanence of our subordinate status." This is from a paper called Racial Realism from the Connecticut Law Review. He also wrote a book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. The subtitle of that book is The Permanence of Racism. Derek Bell also believed that ending racial segregation ultimately served the interests of white people. His thesis was that racial progress only happens when it benefits white people. Regarding the end to racial segregation, he thought that sympathy, mercy, and evolving standards of social decency and conscience amounted to little, if anything. The interests of whites and Black, for a brief moment, converged. He called this idea interest convergence and made it one of the key tenets of critical race theory. He became a big critic of Brown versus Board of Education and urged his fellow Americans to forswear the struggle for school integration. Next, I'm going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education. Its heroine, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges. Stay tuned for part 3.